Among the decaying folios held in the Missouri Historical Society's ecclesiastical collection, there exists a peculiar anomaly. This is a gap in the continuous documentation of St. Boniface Parish in Millerton Valley. The meticulous records, maintained without interruption since the parish's founding in 1847, contain a conspicuous absence spanning from August to November 1879. When the documentation resumes on December 2nd, it does so with different handwriting. It includes an oblique reference to the restoration of proper pastoral care following unfortunate circumstances. The nature of these circumstances, and the fate of Father Ambrose Blackwood, who had served as parish priest until the mysterious interruption, represent one of the more disturbing chapters in American frontier ecclesiastical history. Millerton Valley developed as a silver mining settlement in the eastern Ozarks. It was established in 1851 following the discovery of promising ore deposits along the limestone ridges that defined the region's topography. By 1875, the town had grown to approximately 1,800 residents. This was a diverse community of miners, merchants, and farming families drawn from various European backgrounds. Irish and German immigrants formed the predominant cultural influences. The spiritual center of this community was St. Boniface Catholic Church. This was a modest but dignified structure of local stone, crowned with a slender bell tower, visible from every corner of the valley. The arrival of Father Ambrose Blackwood in early 1877 initially appeared fortuitous for the growing parish. Transferred from a position in the Philadelphia diocese, Blackwood presented impressive credentials and references attesting to his theological acumen and administrative capabilities. The diocesan transfer documents, still preserved in archdiocesan archives, describe him as a man of considerable learning and persuasive oratory, well suited to guide a parish of increasing prominence and complexity. Standing over 6 feet tall with striking silver-streaked black hair, despite his relative youth, estimated to be approximately 40 years of age, Blackwood made an immediate impression on the Millerton Valley community. His sermons soon gained regional renown for their intellectual sophistication and emotional resonance. The Millerton Valley Gazette, in an article published June 1877, described his Easter homily as a theological tour de force that left even the most educated members of the congregation in states of profound contemplation. Parish records indicate that baptisms and confirmations increased by nearly 40% during his first year. Donations to church coffers reached unprecedented levels. On the surface, Father Blackwood appeared to be precisely what the ambitious parish required: a spiritual leader whose sophistication and worldliness matched the community's aspirations. What the people of Millerton Valley could not have anticipated was that beneath Father Blackwood's charismatic veneer operated a calculating opportunist whose theology served primarily as a vehicle for material acquisition and power. The first indications of his true nature emerged gradually, beginning approximately 9 months after his installation. A letter from Church Committee Treasurer Wilhelm Schmidt to Bishop Hendricks in St. Louis, dated November 1877, makes oblique reference to troubling irregularities in the parish accounts. This letter requested guidance regarding the proper protocols for financial oversight of pastoral discretionary funds. The bishop's response, preserved alongside Schmidt's inquiry, suggests institutional reluctance to interfere with priestly authority. It stated, "The management of day-to-day parish finances falls properly within the purview of ordained leadership. While vigilance against error is commendable, undue scrutiny may create impressions of distrust incompatible with proper ecclesiastical relationships." This effective dismissal of concerns emboldened Father Blackwood. He appears to have interpreted episcopal disinterest as tacit permission to expand his financial manipulations. Throughout 1878, evidence of these manipulations accumulated in various documentary sources, now scattered across multiple archives. The minutes of parish council meetings record increasingly pointed questions regarding expenditures for liturgical improvements that were never installed. They also noted questions regarding charitable disbursements that no impoverished parishioners acknowledged receiving, and diocesan assessments that the St. Louis Chancery never recorded. Father Blackwood deflected these inquiries with practiced indignation. He invoked clerical privilege and implied that questioning his financial decisions constituted questioning the church itself. A particularly revealing document from this period is a private letter from Elizabeth Keller, wife of prominent Millerton Valley merchant Joseph Keller, to her cousin in Chicago. Dated March 15, 1878, she writes, "Father Blackwood has commissioned a new silver tabernacle for the sanctuary at what Joseph considers an extravagant sum, nearly $600 drawn from funds originally designated for the winter coal fund and roof repairs." When the council raised concerns, the good father suggested that their faith was insufficient, that true believers would trust divine providence would warm the church and keep the rain at bay. Joseph returned home in such a state that he could scarcely articulate his frustration without language unsuitable for Christian lips. By early 1879, Blackwood's financial schemes had expanded beyond mere misappropriation of parish funds. County real estate records indicate that he began acquiring property throughout Millerton Valley, using complex financial arrangements that obscured the source of his capital. Between January and July 1879, he secured ownership of 3 substantial parcels. These included a productive farmstead on the valley's eastern approach, a commercial building on the town square, and most significantly, a 5-acre tract adjacent to the recently surveyed railroad right-of-way. Land whose value would increase exponentially once the planned rail connection to St. Louis was completed. The mechanism of these acquisitions reveals Blackwood's methodical exploitation of pastoral relationships. Deed transfers and associated legal correspondence suggest a pattern. He would identify parishioners in financial distress, often following medical emergencies or mining accidents, and offer temporary assistance from special diocesan funds. These funds, which diocesan records confirm never existed, came with promissory notes carrying usurious interest terms. When inevitable default occurred, Blackwood would magnanimously offer to accept property as settlement. He presented himself publicly as a benevolent shepherd, helping his flock avoid complete financial ruin. The diary of Dr. Samuel Harrison, Millerton Valley's physician, provides insight into the human cost of these machinations. In an entry dated April 12, 1879, he wrote, "Visited Thomas Murphy today, consumption progressing rapidly. Found the family in despair not merely from Thomas's condition, but from the impending loss of their home. Mrs. Murphy revealed that they had accepted emergency funds from Father Blackwood following Thomas's lung hemorrhage in January, securing the loan against their property with terms that Mrs. Murphy, in her distress, failed to scrutinize adequately. The interest has accumulated beyond any possibility of repayment from a widow's resources. The farm that has been in Murphy possession for 20 years will transfer to Blackwood upon Thomas's death, which I fear approaches rapidly." Such predatory practices continued largely unchallenged due to Blackwood's careful cultivation of relationships with Millerton Valley's most influential citizens. Town records indicate that he hosted regular dinner parties for select members of the community, local government officials, successful business owners, and the superintendent of the principal mining operation. These social engagements, unusual for a parish priest in a frontier community, served to insulate Blackwood from criticism while providing opportunities to gather information useful for his financial schemes. The catalyst that finally transformed simmering resentment into active resistance arrived in the form of the widow Sullivan's donation scandal. Margaret Sullivan, whose husband Michael had died in a mining collapse the previous year, had maintained her family through careful management of the modest insurance payment provided by the mining company. A devout parishioner, she sought Father Blackwood's financial counsel regarding the remaining funds, approximately $370, a significant sum representing her children's future security. According to multiple witness accounts later collected by town officials, Blackwood convinced her to entrust the entire amount to him for investment in a guaranteed diocesan fund returning 8% annual interest. No such fund existed. Investigation of Blackwood's private correspondence, discovered after subsequent events, revealed that he had immediately transferred Sullivan's money to his personal account at the Merchants Bank in St. Louis. From there, he then financed the purchase of additional land along the planned railroad corridor. When Margaret Sullivan, facing her daughter's illness in July 1879, requested a partial withdrawal from her investment, Blackwood informed her that ecclesiastical investment funds could not be accessed before their maturation date. He offered instead a high-interest loan against her modest home. This callous exploitation of a widow's vulnerability catalyzed the formation of what local newspaper accounts would later euphemistically refer to as the Parishioners Committee for Financial Accountability. In reality, this group, comprised initially of Wilhelm Schmidt, Joseph Keller, Dr. Harrison, and mine foreman Patrick Donovan, represented the first organized resistance to Blackwood's predations. The committee's initial approach adhered to proper procedural channels. They drafted a detailed letter to Bishop Hendricks on August 3, 1879, documenting specific instances of financial impropriety and predatory behavior. This letter was supported by affidavits from affected parishioners and certified copies of questionable financial instruments. The diocese's response, which arrived via telegraph on August 17th, followed the established pattern of institutional inertia. It stated, "Investigation will be conducted through proper channels. Father Dolan will visit parish for assessment following completion of seminary teaching obligations in late October. Maintain discretion and proper deference to ordained authority until official determination of facts." For the already agitated community of Millerton Valley, this bureaucratic postponement of justice proved intolerable. The committee convened an expanded meeting at Donovan's home on the evening of August 18th. 23 men attended, representing families who had suffered direct financial harm from Blackwood's schemes. The notes from this gathering, preserved in Patrick Donovan's personal papers, reveal a community transitioning from patience to direct action. The notes read, "It is the unanimous determination of those assembled that the diocese has abdicated its supervisory responsibility through repeated delays and dismissals of legitimate grievances. The protection of the parish and recovery of misappropriated funds cannot await distant ecclesiastical processes when families face immediate dispossession." The group formulated a three-stage approach, beginning with confrontation and escalating based on Blackwood's response. A delegation would present him with documented evidence of his malfeasance. They would demand immediate resignation and restitution of misappropriated funds and offer safe passage to the St. Louis stagecoach. This plan, while direct, maintained at least the outward appearance of civilized process. On the morning of August 20th, the delegation, consisting of Schmidt, Keller, Donovan, and Dr. Harrison, arrived at the parish house adjacent to St. Boniface Church. What they discovered altered the trajectory of subsequent events, transforming measured confrontation into something darker. Father Blackwood, apparently alerted to the committee's activities by a sympathetic parishioner, had accelerated his exploitation. The parish house showed evidence of hasty document destruction, with account books and correspondence burned in the fireplace. More alarmingly, the tabernacle had been forced open and emptied of its valuable contents, including a silver ciborium and paten donated by the founding families of the parish. The church's emergency fund lockbox had been pried open, its contents, approximately $230 in cash, removed. Most damning, however, was the discovery on Blackwood's writing desk of draft transfer documents for 5 additional properties, including the Sullivan home and the Murphy's farm. These transfers, prepared but not yet filed with the county clerk, would have consolidated Blackwood's ownership of nearly 20% of Millerton Valley's private property, all acquired through manipulation of pastoral relationships and misrepresentation of financial arrangements. The delegation's response was swift and organized, with a precision suggesting that more extreme contingencies had been contemplated from the outset. Within hours, riders were dispatched along all possible routes Blackwood might have taken. Telegraph messages were sent to neighboring towns with instructions to detain the priest if seen. What had begun as an effort to remove a financial predator through quasi-official means transformed into a methodical manhunt across the Ozark landscape. For 3 days, search parties combed the countryside while the community in Millerton Valley conducted a more thorough investigation of Blackwood's activities. A systematic examination of church records revealed the full extent of his schemes. Approximately $3,700 in parish funds had been diverted to personal accounts. 27 families had been entangled in predatory financial arrangements. Blackwood had accumulated property valued at over $12,000, an enormous sum in the frontier economy of 1879, all while presenting himself as a humble servant of God dependent on parish charity. On August 23rd, as summer heat shimmered across the valley, two miners returning from a prospecting expedition encountered Father Blackwood at a remote hunting cabin approximately 12 miles east of town. According to their subsequent statements, they discovered the priest in the company of two hired men who appeared to be guarding several trunks and saddlebags. A brief exchange of gunfire occurred, initiated, the miners insisted, by Blackwood's companions, resulting in the wounding of one guard and the flight of the other. Blackwood himself surrendered without physical resistance once his protectors had been neutralized. The miners, brothers Caleb and Joshua Renfro, secured their prisoner and the recovered property. Rather than returning immediately to Millerton Valley, they dispatched a message to Patrick Donovan. Have caught the fox with his plunder. Await instructions at Kincaid's old cabin. The response came within hours. Secure position. Party en route. What followed has been partially obscured by the selective documentation that often characterizes community justice in American frontier history. A group of 14 men, including the original committee members and representatives of the most significantly victimized families, departed Millerton Valley after sunset on horseback. They traveled without torches despite the moonless night, demonstrating both determination and familiarity with the terrain. Upon reaching the hunting cabin shortly after midnight, they took custody of Father Blackwood and the recovered valuables from the Renfro brothers. According to limited testimony later provided by Caleb Renfro, Blackwood initially attempted to negotiate. He offered to surrender all property and deeds in exchange for safe passage to St. Louis. When this approach failed, he allegedly invoked ecclesiastical protection and threatened excommunication for any who interfered with an ordained priest. The committee was unmoved, having already determined that Blackwood's exploitation of religious authority forfeited any claim to its protection. The subsequent hours remain the most obscured in the historical record, intentionally undocumented by participants. What is known with certainty is that the party did not immediately return to Millerton Valley. They remained at the isolated cabin until dawn, conducting what Patrick Donovan's journal cryptically refers to as a thorough accounting of transgressions. The only specific detail he records is that the ledger of sins grew longer with each hour of examination, revealing corruptions beyond our initial reckoning. At dawn, the party began their return journey to Millerton Valley, bringing with them a physically diminished but still living Father Blackwood. They did not attempt to conceal their procession, riding openly through the countryside in broad daylight and eventually down the main street shortly before noon. Witnesses described a scene of somber ceremony rather than chaotic vigilantism. Blackwood, bound and mounted on his own horse, showed evidence of rigorous questioning but remained conscious. The party proceeded directly to St. Boniface Church. What transpired next has become central to Millerton Valley's suppressed historical narrative. The 14-man committee led Blackwood into the church where, according to multiple accounts, nearly 200 townspeople had gathered upon hearing of the priest's capture. Wilhelm Schmidt reportedly read aloud a detailed accounting of Blackwood's financial predations. This included his exploitation of widows, orphans, and the ill. The document named 32 individuals or families who had suffered direct financial harm, with estimated total damages exceeding $15,000. More dramatic still was the presentation of a written confession, signed by Blackwood himself, acknowledging systematic financial fraud, embezzlement of church funds, and exploitation of pastoral relationships for personal gain. The document, later filed with county authorities, included a comprehensive inventory of misappropriated assets and fraudulently obtained properties, all of which Blackwood relinquished claim to as part of his confessed restitution. The proceedings that followed deviated sharply from legal procedure, but adhered to a grim ceremonial logic that reflected the community's deeply held sense of betrayed faith. Father Blackwood was taken to the front of the church and positioned before the large wooden crucifix that hung above the altar. There, in a perversion of the ecclesiastical ritual, the men stripped him of his clerical vestments, removing each item, stole, chasuble, alb, with deliberate care while reciting the financial crimes that had betrayed its symbolic significance. Elizabeth Keller's letter to her cousin, dated September 7th, provides the most comprehensive account of what followed. She wrote, "They removed his priestly garments one by one, naming with each removal a family he had deceived or a sacred trust he had violated. The stole, symbol of his authority to hear confession, was taken for his betrayal of Margaret Sullivan's trust. The chasuble, his Eucharistic garment, removed for his theft of the sacred vessels themselves. When he stood in only his underclothes, trembling before the congregation, William Schmidt produced a set of simple work clothes, the attire of a common laborer, and these were placed upon him as his new garments. "By deception you came among us dressed as a shepherd," Schmidt declared. "By truth you depart dressed as the wolf you are." What occurred next transformed an act of community justice into something far more symbolically charged and disturbing. The large wooden crucifix, central to the church's liturgical space, was removed from its position above the altar. According to multiple accounts, Blackwood was then bound to this crucifix, not as a means of execution, but as a ritual of symbolic inversion. His arms were extended along the cross beam, his feet secured to the vertical post, creating a visual parallel to the corpus of Christ that normally adorned the sacred object. Dr. Harrison's private notes contain the most clinical description of this procedure. He wrote, "Care was taken to secure the subject without causing permanent physical damage. Padded leather restraints rather than nails were employed, allowing for eventual release without permanent impairment. The positioning was precise, a mimicry of crucifixion without its lethal consequences, designed to create maximum psychological impact through theological inversion. The crucifix with Blackwood bound upon it was then raised upright and displayed before the assembled congregation." Patrick Donovan later recorded that no woman or child was permitted to witness this portion of the proceedings. Only the men of the parish who had suffered direct financial injury remained present. This display reportedly continued for approximately 3 hours, during which Blackwood experienced what Donovan described as the weight of contemplating his sins against the very symbol of sacrifice he had professed to serve. Joseph Keller's business ledger contains a single anomalous entry dated August 24th that provides additional context. It reads, "The judgment of inversion. He who elevated himself through false piety is elevated truly to face those he deceived. He who profited from the cross must hang upon it, not unto death, but unto understanding." 3 hours he remained, as long as the darkness at Golgotha, before being lowered. This ritual of symbolic crucifixion, disturbing even by the standards of frontier justice, represented a community's attempt to create punishment that reflected both the nature of the transgression and their own theological framework. Blackwood had weaponized religious authority and symbols for material gain. His punishment appropriated those same symbols to create a temporary but profound inversion of the power dynamics he had exploited. After Blackwood was lowered from the crucifix, still alive though psychologically shattered, the community's justice took a more conventional turn. He was placed in the town jail while arrangements were made for the return of stolen funds and the nullification of fraudulent property transfers. 3 days later, a delegation of 4 armed men escorted him to St. Louis. They delivered him to diocesan authorities along with comprehensive documentation of his crimes and the community's handling of the situation. The diocesan response, documented in chancery records, demonstrates institutional discomfort with both Blackwood's crimes and the community's direct action. The record states, "The matter of Father Ambrose Blackwood has been addressed through extraordinary channels necessitated by urgent local circumstances. While the diocese cannot condone extra-ecclesiastical proceedings in matters of clerical discipline, the gravity of the financial improprieties involved and the comprehensive documentation provided by the Millerton Valley delegation compels serious attention. Father Blackwood will remain under diocesan restriction pending thorough investigation and determination of appropriate canonical penalties." For the community of Millerton Valley, this official acknowledgement, however reluctant, provided validation of their actions. The aftermath focused on practical matters of recovery and restoration. Property deeds fraudulently obtained by Blackwood were systematically invalidated through county court proceedings, with ownership returned to the original families. Funds recovered from Blackwood's luggage, approximately $1,900 in cash and negotiable instruments, were placed in a community restitution fund administered by a committee of respected citizens. This committee included 2 women appointed specifically to represent the interests of widows who had been particular targets of the priest's schemes. St. Boniface Parish entered a period of rebuilding, both physically and spiritually. For 2 months, lay leaders conducted simple prayer services while the diocese deliberated on a replacement priest. In November 1879, Father Michael Brennan arrived to find a community profoundly transformed by its encounter with corruption and its own capacity for direct action against authority. His first official act, recorded in the restored parish records that resume on December 2nd, was to consecrate a new crucifix, the previous one having been considered irrevocably tainted by its use in Blackwood's ritual punishment. The aftermath of the Blackwood incident created lasting psychological and social effects in Millerton Valley. The mining town, once known for its exceptional religious devotion, developed a complex and ambivalent relationship with ecclesiastical authority. Church attendance remained strong, but parishioners displayed a heightened vigilance regarding clerical behavior that bordered on suspicion. Father Brennan recorded in his private journal that he had never before served a congregation that observes its shepherd with such careful attention. More significant were the effects on those directly involved in Blackwood's symbolic crucifixion. The 14 men who formed the core group never publicly acknowledged their specific actions, but private records indicate profound psychological consequences. Patrick Donovan resigned his position as mine foreman in 1881, citing a desire to seek a new beginning unburdened by memory. Dr. Harrison's medical notes show he began self-prescribing increasing amounts of laudanum in the months following the incident. His handwriting became noticeably erratic by 1882, and he died of heart failure in 1884, though contemporary understanding suggests probable substance addiction. For the families who had suffered under Blackwood's predations, the community's extreme action provided a complex legacy. Some experienced a measure of psychological relief following the ritual punishment, interpreting the community's action as validation of their suffering and a definitive assurance that justice had been served. Others, however, developed complicated associations between religious imagery and retribution that persisted into subsequent generations. Elizabeth Keller's later correspondence notes that her husband cannot look upon the new crucifix without visibly paling, though he attends Mass with unfailing regularity. As for Father Ambrose Blackwood himself, his subsequent fate remains partially obscured. Diocesan records indicate that he was laicized through an expedited process completed in early 1880, permanently removing his clerical status. Criminal charges were never filed, the Church preferring to handle the matter internally rather than invite public scrutiny of clerical misconduct. The last documented reference to Blackwood appears in an 1883 police report from Chicago, where a confidence scheme targeting elderly widows was attributed to A. Blackwood, formerly of Philadelphia and St. Louis, presenting himself as a financial agent for religious charitable organizations. The report notes that the suspect fled before arrest, leaving no further official trace in historical records. The physical evidence of what occurred in St. Boniface Church was methodically erased. The crucifix was destroyed and replaced with a new one donated by a church in St. Louis. The wooden floor beneath, stained during Blackwood's ordeal, was covered with a permanent carpet runner. When the church roof required repairs in 1892, the opportunity was taken to replace the ceiling beam from which the crucifix had been suspended. Gradually, the material connections to the event were systematically removed, though the psychological imprint remained embedded in community consciousness. What makes the Millerton Valley incident particularly significant in the study of frontier justice is not merely the punishment itself. Vigilante actions were not uncommon in turn-of-the-century America, but rather the ritualistic nature of the punishment and the community's complete subversion of religious symbolism as an instrument of retribution. Unlike many acts of frontier justice from this period, which often displayed chaotic or impulsive characteristics, the punishment of Father Blackwood demonstrated calculated ceremonial elements that transformed an act of vengeance into a communal ritual of purification and boundary restoration. Anthropologists who have studied the limited documentation of the case note parallels to pre-Christian practices of symbolic punishment, where the method of retribution recapitulated the nature of the transgression. Father Blackwood had weaponized religious authority to exploit the most vulnerable members of his congregation. His temporary crucifixion, binding him to the central symbol of the faith he had betrayed, represented a community's attempt to cleanse sacred space that had been profoundly violated. The story of Millerton Valley and Father Blackwood eventually faded from public consciousness. The town itself declined as mining operations grew less profitable in the 1890s, and by 1920 the population had dwindled to fewer than 800 residents. St. Boniface Church continued to operate until 1963, when the diocese consolidated several rural parishes. The building stood vacant for nearly a decade before being demolished. Today, only the cemetery remains, its weathered headstones offering mute testimony to generations of Millerton Valley residents, including several of Blackwood's victims and those who enacted vengeance on their behalf. The written record of these events survives primarily in scattered documents preserved by historical societies, family collections, and diocesan archives. The official history of the parish, compiled in 1947 for a regional ecclesiastical survey, mentions Father Blackwood only briefly, noting that he served the parish from 1877 to 1879 before departing under undocumented circumstances. This sanitized accounting reflects both the Church's institutional preference for discretion regarding scandalous episodes and the community's own complicated relationship with the memory of its darkest chapter. Perhaps the most poignant artifact related to the Blackwood case is a small, hand-stitched altar cloth created by Margaret Sullivan in 1881. Preserved by her descendants, the embroidery incorporates an unusual pattern that scholars of American folk art have identified as a stylized representation of a crucifix overlaid with protective symbols drawn from various traditions. The centerpiece of the design features the Latin phrase, veritas liberat, the truth sets free, surrounded by tiny meticulous stitches forming a barrier pattern common in Appalachian folk craft. This syncretic object suggests a mind struggling to reconcile Christian faith with the memory of sanctified retribution, seeking protection through a blend of orthodox religion and folk practice. The events in Millerton Valley occurred during a period when American society was negotiating the tension between frontier justice and emerging systems of institutional authority. The industrial age brought standardized legal procedures and centralized church governance, gradually displacing the localized, community-based responses to transgression that had characterized earlier American history. The Blackwood case represents a community caught in this transition, sufficiently connected to modern institutions to attempt official remedies initially, yet ultimately reverting to direct action when those institutions failed to provide timely protection for the vulnerable. This pattern of institutional failure, followed by community action, echoes through numerous episodes in American history, yet few display the ritualistic complexity and theological subtext of the Millerton Valley incident. The symbolic crucifixion of Father Blackwood represented not merely punishment, but a community's attempt to restore a moral and spiritual boundary that had been catastrophically breached. By appropriating and inverting the very symbols of religious authority that Blackwood had exploited, the people of Millerton Valley enacted a form of restorative justice intended to reconsecrate violated space and reclaim theological meaning. As the last directory participants in these events passed away in the early decades of the 20th century, the story of Father Blackwood and the symbolic crucifixion of Millerton Valley transitioned from suppressed communal memory to historical footnote. Yet the psychological patterns established during this episode, institutional betrayal, community solidarity in the face of external inquiry, and the ritualization of punishment as moral restoration, continue to resonate in American responses to corruption and institutional failure. The Yellowed Church records with their cryptic final entry about Father Blackwood stand as a reminder that beneath the surface of documented history lie complicated truths about justice, community, and the human capacity for both sophisticated exploitation and symbolic retribution.